Okay, we're picking up with June 2015, and now question 26. What was the major cause of African American migration from the South to northern cities during World War I? That is known as the, quote, Great Migration, and millions of African Americans, right as World War I was starting, moved from southern rural areas, sharecropping and so on, up to cities in the north like New York, Detroit, Cincinnati, Cleveland. And why? Because availability of factory jobs. As the nation prepared to go to war, and war always means huge increases in production of weapons and all kinds of other equipment. These factories were booming. They were looking for people, and a lot of Southern blacks got fed up. You know, not that conditions were great in the North for blacks, but they weren't as horrible as they were in the South. So why not move up north? One of the things that this triggers, it's not questioned here, but they do ask, is the Harlem Renaissance. That is, you had a group of African Americans in New York City who formed a community up in the neighborhood that is Harlem, and that becomes a center for African American culture, jazz music, and not progressive jazz that you guys might think of, but stuff like the big band music, the dance music of the era comes out of it. So do great playwrights and poets, A Raisin in the Sun and so on, comes out of the Harlem Renaissance. Painters, it was a great cultural explosion. Okay, 27. After World War I, a, quote, return to normalcy. Okay, return to normalcy was Warren Harding's campaign slogan. He campaigned against the United States joining the League of Nations. So, opposition to join the League of Nations. Why? The end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson comes back from Europe with the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles has to be ratified, approved by the U.S. Senate in Congress. Part of the treaty is the League of Nations, an international body that would have been a kind of police force to ensure peace. So if any nation got out of line, started attacking its neighbors, the other members of the League of Nations were required by the treaty to jump in and stop them. Sounds like a good idea, but the problem is that it takes the power to declare war out of the hands of the Congress. We would have signed a treaty that we would have automatically had to go to war in times of that kind of emergency in the League. U.S. senators, who were isolationist, said, now that the war is over, we want to, quote, return to normalcy. And by normalcy, they meant isolationism. Back when the United States just did its own thing, left Europe alone, stayed out of world affairs. Warren Harding was one of the guys who supported that. And the League of Nations was seen as getting us too involved in world affairs. There we go. The term Harlem Renaissance best describes a period of African American cultural achievements. This is 19-teens, 1920s into 1930s in Harlem. In 29, in the 1920s, controversies over prohibition, the National Origins Act, and the Scopes trial. Now, let's think about those. Prohibition is about prohibiting liquor. The National Origins Act we talked about in the 1920s. This was a law that set quotas on immigration. Before the 1920s, basically anybody who wanted to come to America, except the Chinese, were welcome. In the 1920s, we create this quota system under the National Origins Act that more or less shuts down immigration. The Scopes trial, remember, was the trial of that guy in Tennessee for teaching evolution in a public school classroom, which was seen as an attack on Bible-believing religion. So those three, Prohibition, National Origins Act, and Scopes trial, all reflected disagreement over what? Cultural values of the American people. As I said, in the 1920s, America was starting to wonder what direction it was going in. Prohibition was going to make us all moral. Fight over the Scopes trial was about bringing good old-fashioned religion back. National Origins Act was fear that these immigrants were changing the country. Largely Italian immigrants was what they were worried about. So it was fight over cultural values of the American people. Okay, let's go on to 30. Base your answers to questions 30 and 31 on the passage below. Alright, so we look at the passage, and let's just see, this is a passage by Senator Huey Long, 1935. 1935 tells you what? 1930s, Great Depression. Huey Long was a very radical, left-wing, big government senator. So, what is he saying here? We propose to limit the amount any one man can earn in 1 year or inherit to $1 million per person. Now, by limiting the size of the fortunes and incomes of the big men, we will throw into the government treasury the money and property from which we will care for the millions of people who have nothing. And with this money, we will provide a home and the comforts of home, and such common conveniences as radio and automobile for every family in America, free of debt. Alright, so what did Huey Long propose? And this was all real, by the way. Huey Long's campaign slogan was, "Every man a king." He thought nobody should have more than $1 million. That was enough of a fortune for any man. And anything over $1 million should go into the common fund and get redistributed out to the people. Okay. Which is far more radical than anything Franklin Delano Roosevelt ever proposed. Based on these statements by Senator Long, one reason for the suffering caused by the Great Depression was uneven distribution of income that favored the rich. Huey Long believed that the cause of the Depression was the rich getting richer and sucking the money away from the poor. Franklin Delano Roosevelt responded to the circumstances described in this passage by doing what? Increasing New Deal efforts for relief and reform. Remember, the New Deal was not about helping big business, really. The New Deal was about restarting the economy, but by helping the little guy. Raising taxes to assure a balanced federal budget. FDR was not interested in balancing the federal budget. He was okay with overspending, with borrowing money. He thought that that was okay because once the economy fixed itself, America's debt would fix itself. Stressing free market economic principles. Well, FDR did believe in capitalism, but he was much more concerned about stressing government involvement in capitalism. So the only one that makes sense here is FDR responded to the Great Depression by increasing New Deal efforts for relief and reform. Okay, let's look at 32. What was the motive behind President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 1937 proposal to add members to the Supreme Court? Remember, 9 members of the Supreme Court. By 1937, the court was starting to put the brakes on FDR's ideas, saying maybe the president is getting too much power here. FDR proposed increasing the number of justices from 9 to 15. That would have let him appoint 6 new justices, which would have meant that he was sure of having a majority on the court. Why did he propose that? Well, removal of Republican justices doesn't work because he can't remove a justice. Ending the court's use of judicial review, he can't really propose that. That's in the Constitution. Assuring U.S. neutrality, the court had nothing to do with U.S. neutrality, and Roosevelt was not particularly neutral. He wanted the U.S. to back Europe, and 1937 is before the war even starts, so number 3 makes no sense at all. Protection of New Deal programs from unfavorable court decisions. That's the one that makes sense. Okay, let's look at 33. Which trend in United States foreign policy is shown by the passage of the Neutrality Act of 1939, the Destroyers for Bases Deal of 1940, and the Lend-Lease Act of 1941? And the correct answer would be increase in support for the Allied powers. So in 39, we're neutral, but by 41, we're doing Lend-Lease, so we have increased our support for the Allies. Number 34, the internment of Japanese Americans, that is, taking Japanese Americans and putting them into camps, interning them, that's called, was initially authorized by an executive order of the president. Remember, Roosevelt gives that order as commander-in-chief. He's claiming he's doing it basically as part of the military defenses of the West Coast. Okay, now we have a map here. Base your answers to questions 35 and 36 on the map below, and your knowledge of social studies. So the map, we have a map of what? Pacific Ocean, Japan, and we see dates 45, 45, 44, 42. Okay, so this is a map of Second World War. Okay, and it shows you that the dark gray color here is areas under Japanese control, so that's all the area that Japan had conquered at the beginning of U.S. involvement in World War II in 1942. So they had invaded China, they had invaded French Indochina, which today we call Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, Thailand, Burma, which today is called Myanmar, the Dutch East Indies, which today is called Indonesia, and so this whole area, this is now under Japanese control. Okay. And what else do we see here? Okay, so the arrows, these big arrows, are Allied advances. So we go from Pearl Harbor, and we go invading the islands all along here, the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, into Guam, and then from Guam, Iwo Jima, famously. Okinawa up here. We also invaded from down in the south here. This is Australia. So we had come up from Australia through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea and Indonesia to the Philippines. Okinawa is a kind of double effort from launch from the Philippines and from Guam. And then finally, of course, you have the bombing of Hiroshima and the bombing of Nagasaki there at the end of the war. Okay, so now we know what this map says. And let's figure out what's the question. What's the most accurate title for this map? Obviously, World War II in the Pacific. Look, that had better be really obvious to all of you. The map shows that the Allied forces did what? Does it show that they had military support from the Soviet Union? I don't see anything about the Soviet Union here. It mentions the Soviet Union, but it doesn't show any support. And in fact, the Soviet Union was so busy in Europe, they really didn't get involved in the Pacific. Does it show that Allied forces maintained control of the Philippines from the beginning of the war? No, it shows we had to invade the Philippines to get it back from the Japanese. That's wrong. Conducted most battles north of the Hawaiian Islands. Well, there's the Hawaiian Islands, and there's the line from the Hawaiian Islands. Most of the battles were actually south of the Hawaiian Islands. Made slow but steady progress in defeating Japan. Well, if you look at the map, what does it show? Battles in June of 42 and May of 42, August of 42, October 44, November 44, March of 45, June of 45, August of 45. So that's the only one that makes sense. The Allies made slow but steady progress, hopping from island to island to island to island to island until we get to Japan. Okay. Question 37. One of the reasons the United States supported the creation of the United Nations. All right, so at the end of the Second World War, we win, and the United States and the other nations that had fought in the Second World War create the United Nations, a replacement for the old League of Nations, but one that we hoped was better thought out and would work better. So what was the point of the United Nations? Real simple. Maintain international peace. The hope of the UN was that we'd never have to fight a third world war. Number 38. The announcement of the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, the formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization were actions taken by the United States. Okay, so let's talk about this. After the Second World War, immediately the world divides up into the free world led by the United States and the communist world led by Russia. So from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the whole world is divided between us and them, the free world and the communists. And everything you do in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s, you have to think of in those terms. It's all about that conflict. So during the Cold War, you have first the Truman Doctrine. What was the Truman Doctrine? Just as the Monroe Doctrine said the U.S. would protect the independence of the new countries in Latin America, the Truman Doctrine said the U.S. would protect free democratic countries from communists all over the world. The Berlin Airlift. The city of Berlin in Germany was this little island in the midst of East Germany. So let's look at a map for just a minute. Okay, so at the end of the war, this was Germany. The Allies decided to divide up Germany into zones. So the United States was in charge of this part, the French were in charge of this part, which is on the French border, the British were in charge of this part, and the Soviet Union was in charge of this part. The Allies went into this with the assumption that they would reunite Germany. Once the we had sort of rebuilt and reorganized the German government, we'd come up with a way that, Germany could continue on as a country. The Soviet Union refused to go along with the plan, and so the American zone, the French zone, and the British zone all merged, and they became the country of West Germany that existed up through the 1980s. The Soviet zone became the country of East Germany that existed up through the 1980s. When Truman was president, the Russians, I should point out, Berlin here, you see Berlin is in that gray color. Berlin itself as a city was also divided in half. So the Russians controlled East Berlin, and West Berlin was part of West Germany, even though it sits as a kind of island in the middle of the Soviet zone of East Germany. The Russians weren't happy that the Allies were controlling that bit of Berlin, and so they surrounded it, blockaded it, and refused to allow supplies in. So the Allies set up an airlift and flew planes in to drop by parachute supplies to keep West Berlin from starving to death, and to stand up to the Russians and say, you're not going to take over West Berlin. That will remain a free city, even though it's in the middle of this island, and it will remain part of West Germany, even though it's in the middle of this country of East Germany. That was the Berlin airlift. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, is the military alliance led by the United States of the free countries, the non-communist countries of the world, standing up to the old Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had its own alliance called the Warsaw Pact, which was all of the communist countries. Okay. So the Truman Doctrine, we will defend free democracies from communism everywhere. The Berlin airlift, where we physically defend the freedom of this little bit of land called West Berlin. And the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, this military alliance, they were all actions taken by the United States to do what? Prevent the expansion of communism into Western Europe, to keep the Russians from taking over the free countries of Western Europe. Okay. Base your answer to question 39 on the speech below. So here's a speech. John F. Kennedy, President, 1962, October of 1962. Okay, here we go. Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. All right, so what is this speech about? The Cuban Missile Crisis. Cuba, we remember, had been a free country. In the 1950s, it was under the control of a pretty vicious military dictator, a guy named Batista. The people of Cuba had rebelled against this Batista guy, and their leader, Fidel Castro, had gotten rid of Batista, become dictator himself, and made Cuba a communist country. The United States had, bad relations, was hostile to Cuba after the communists took over there. Cuba made an alliance with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union tried to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. Cuba is just 90 miles from Florida. And it's not just about Florida. If they're that close to Florida, that's how close they are to the rest of the country. If the Russians had put missiles in there, you could have shot a missile from Cuba to pretty much any city in the eastern United States in a matter of minutes. The missile would have shot off, come down, and destroyed Washington, D.C. before we even knew they had launched the missile. It freaked Americans out. And so you had this event in October of 1962 called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy blockades Cuba. He sends the U.S. Navy down to surround Cuba to prevent the Russian ships carrying these missiles from showing up in Cuba. The U.S. and the Soviet Union came within a hair's breadth of nuclear war. Soviet Union finally backed down. Secretly, the United States agreed, if you back down, we will take our nuclear weapons out of Turkey. Turkey is on the Russian border. And so the situation was diffused. But for a few weeks there, it looked like the United States and Russia were going to go to nuclear war. We came very, very close. So this is the speech. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missiles is now in preparation on that imprisoned island, meaning Cuba. The purposes of these bases could be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. President Kennedy strongly reacted to the situation described in the speech, primarily because the location of Cuba would allow the United States little time to respond to an attack. They could have wiped out most of the major cities, at least in the eastern half of the U.S., literally in a matter of minutes. That's the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, let's look at question 40. One criticism of the Warren Court's decisions. Here we go. The Warren Court, as you should know from the notes, is named for Chief Justice Earl Warren. He was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And whoever the Chief Justice is, we often refer to that time period in the court by their name. The Warren Court issued several famous decisions. Mapp v. Ohio, which again is mentioned in the notes, is the Supreme Court said that evidence the cops obtain in an illegal search cannot be used against the defendant. It's called the exclusionary rule, and it's to prevent the cops from making illegal searches. Gideon versus Wainwright was a court decision in which the court said, you are entitled to a lawyer. If you are arrested, you have a right to have a lawyer assist you in court, because that's only fair. It gives everybody an equal protection in front of the court. Miranda v. Arizona, famous decision, says that when the police arrest you, they must inform you of your rights. You have a right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution not to incriminate yourself. The cops cannot make you confess. That's to prevent the cops from forcing confessions out of people. The Miranda decision is the reason why, you all know it from TV, when they arrest you, a cop has to say, you have the right to remain silent. If you give up this right, anything and everything you say can and will be used against you. You have the right to have an attorney present at question. If you can't afford an attorney, the court will appoint one for you. Those decisions, if any of you have relatives who are police officers, that's called Mirandizing a suspect. That is, to inform them of their rights under the Miranda decision. Okay, well, that certainly protected the rights of defendants. But it was also controversial. a lot of people said we're being too soft on people who are arrested. So those decisions limited police powers while expanding the rights of criminal defendants. Okay, during the 1960s, the foreign policy of President Lyndon B. Johnson was criticized because it escalated the Vietnam War. Johnson was the president who really took the United States fully into the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War goes back to President Kennedy, as we discussed, but it was really Johnson who put the U.S. in there in a big way, and he wound up having to, he did not run for re-election as president because he had become so unpopular. 42. The decision of the Supreme Court in the case of U.S. versus Nixon. This is during the Watergate affair, remember? Nixon had used the FBI, the CIA, a lot of government employees as a kind of private political spy force. A couple of them had been caught breaking into the Democratic Party's national headquarters. Nixon was a Republican. The Democratic Party's headquarters was in a hotel in Washington called the Watergate Hotel. And when they were caught, Nixon kind of used all of his power as president secretly to try to prevent the investigation from going forward. Because when the investigation went forward, it showed how extensively he had been using the government in a corrupt way against political enemies. Nixon had had a series of conversations in his office with his advisors about this. Those conversations were taped, the Nixon tapes. So Nixon, the court said, we want to listen to the tapes. Nixon said, I have executive privilege. Executive privilege is the right that the president has to confidentiality in his conversations with his advisors. The theory is that if people are going to give honest advice to the president, they have to be confident that it's not going to get broadcast to everybody. He has to be able to speak frankly and honestly with his advisors without other people sort of butting into that. The Supreme Court found, though, that in his conversations, he had engaged in a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice, that is, to get in the way of the investigation, and that was not covered by executive privilege. So number 3 is the correct answer there. Okay, let's go on. Alright, political cartoon. They love to throw political cartoons on here. Alright, so here we have American guy. My job was outsourced to China, so I borrowed money from the Chinese to afford these Chinese fireworks. Made in China. You have a nice Independence Day. Okay, so that's ironic. Yeah? Lost his job to China, borrowed money from the Chinese too he lost his job from, so he could buy products from China to celebrate American Independence Day. Okay, whoops. What's the most accurate? Where are we? Which statement most accurately expresses the point of view of the cartoonist? The American economy has become overly dependent on China. Many American corporations contributed to the problem shown in the cartoon by establishing manufacturing facilities overseas, that is, moving their factories to places like China. That should have been easy. Another cartoon. Again, they like cartoons. Social Security. You see Social Security there, and it's cracking and breaking. And we criticize other countries for not building earthquake-proof structures. So Social Security crumbling. What is considered a major cause of the problem shown in the cartoon? The growing number of Social Security recipients are being supported by fewer workers. If you remember, and I put it in the notes, one of the big problems we face is that Social Security was started in the 1930s. Retirement age was 65. The average age of death of an American worker was 62. So, in theory, most people never collected Social Security because they were dead by then. Now people retire at 65, some people 67, and the average age of death is pushing 80. So we've gone from most people not collecting Social Security at all to most people collecting at least 15 years worth of Social Security. And the number of young workers is decreasing as a percentage of the number of people on Social Security. That is to say, when Social Security started in the 30s, you might have, pick a number, 10 workers for every person who's retired. So those 10 workers are paying into the system, and the one retired worker is taking out of it. Now, it's going the other way. Eventually, you'll have 10 retired people for every worker. That's the problem that they're trying to figure out now. How do we keep Social Security going? Okay, let's look at these now. Oh, and now they do this sometimes. At the very end of the Regents exam, they suddenly throw in a bunch of questions from early in American history or earlier. One important goal of the Monroe Doctrine was to do what? Prevent former colonial powers from taking over Latin American nations. That was the whole point. President Monroe in 1823 said, you European countries, you stay out of the Americas. Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Agreement signed in the 1970s by the U.S. and the Soviet Union were efforts to reduce Cold War tensions. Strategic arms is code word, if you like, for nuclear weapons. So the SALT treaties, as they were called, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, were the U.S. and the Soviet Union agreeing to cut down on the number of nuclear weapons both sides had. Number 48, troops break up bonus army protest. We remember the bonus army. FDR proclaims bank holiday. Misery created by Dust Bowl. These headlines concern events that occurred during when? The Great Depression. The bonus army were those veterans who marched on Washington at the beginning of the Depression, trying to get basically their military pensions early. Roosevelt declared the bank holiday. You remember we talked about in class. He shuts down the banks for a few weeks to calm everybody out before they bankrupt the banks so that they can reopen in an orderly way. And the Dust Bowl was that natural disaster out in the Midwest where all those farmers got displaced, and it happened to take place during the Great Depression. Okay. 49. Another cartoon. How come I always get stuck with the tab? Miss Civil Liberties. I get stuck with tab, I gotta pay. What's the bill here? Anti-terrorism orders. And Mr. National Security is walking away with the Patriot Act, domestic wiretapping, torture set, and so on. So what is the point here? Miss Civil Liberties has to pay the price, that is, fewer civil liberties, in the name of national security getting everything it wants. Let's look at the questions. The opinion expressed by the cartoonist is that the USA Patriot Act allows the federal government to violate freedoms guaranteed in the Bill of Rights. That is to say, the Patriot Act lets them spy, lets them wiretap domestic things, lets them torture, and it's civil liberties that suffers for it. This cartoon was published in response to federal actions that followed, of course, the 2001 September 11th attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which is what triggered the Patriot Act in the first place. Okay, I'll leave it there, and then in the next video we'll do the essays.